So just to tell you a little bit about the format, we're going to have two panels. Each of our speakers is going to speak 5 minutes each about the year that's passed, and then go around for a second turn to speak about the year ahead. And the hashtag, if you're tweeting about this, is hashtag Bella2016. So I think we'll just get on with things. We're going to hear from Joyce McMillan first, then from Christopher Silver, then from then from Heather Burns, and then from Andy Wightman. You probably know all of our speakers. Joyce is a theatre critic and columnist and has a book out that's available here tonight, Theatre in Scotland, A Field of Dreams, which I heartily recommend. Christopher Silver is a freelance writer and will also give his book, Demanding Democracy, The Case for a Scottish Media, which is available tonight. And Heather is a digital law specialist we're delighted to have with us tonight. And Andy Wightman is a Green MSP, land activist, author and blogger. So please give a warm welcome to Joyce McMillan.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I had no idea I was going first. I never go first. I always sit here and wait and then comment on what other people have said, but never mind. Let's go. Great pleasure to be here. I think all of us realise how much the Scottish media landscape has changed, particularly during the period of the referendum, and it's now very hard to imagine that landscape without initiatives like Bella Caledonia and a few others that I'm sure you all know and value. So thank you very much, Mike, for your role in that, and all the people involved with Bella Caledonia who are here. I'm not a regular Bella Caledonia writer, of course, but I've written the odd thing, particularly for that publication, actually, which Mike just showed you, Scotland 2021. I did write a chapter for that this year. So the subject we're asked to talk about for our first 5 minutes, and just tell me when I've been going for 5 minutes, Mike, because I won't have a clue. Well, I might, actually, but I'll pretend not to. Anyway, what happened in 2016? Well, okay, I'm going to take a geopolitical view first, and probably I won't have time to get much beyond that. But in a way, doing the book, which I've just done, that book of mine there, which is an anthology of theatre reviews of mine, of theatre in Scotland since 1982, has reminded me of how much my whole working adult life has been shaped by a kind of opposition to the neoliberal project that began around that time when Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister, and it began to be obvious that as Prime Minister she was going to do a lot of the things which she and her neoliberal friends had been discussing in the late 1970s in terms of, at least rhetorically, if not actually, and in some cases both, beginning to oppose the whole welfare state consensus that we had associated with the idea of post-war Britain. She wasn't alone internationally. She had allies, of course, in the Reagan government, which elected in 1980 in America. I had known from an early stage that I didn't like this neoliberal ideology because I had encountered it as a young undergraduate at St Andrews, where many of its British originators were. People like Douglas Mason, the two Butler brothers, one of whom now runs that Heritage Foundation in Washington, which is one of the main sources of neoliberal and now, in fact, neoconservative thinking. Madsen Pirrie, these people from the Adam Smith Foundation, they were all there, and Michael Forsyth and other conservatives like that, of that leaning. So I had heard their ideas at a very early stage in my life. I was only about 20 when I first encountered them, and I thought, well, this is not going to work. And although I've rethought it very often since, I've never really varied from that opinion. I think the neoliberal account of how human society works is just fundamentally flawed. I think it's a misunderstanding both of the individual human being and of the way human society works. I think you can see that from the works of Adam Smith himself, who is their great guru, but in fact would not have agreed, I think, with their kind of amoralised view of how the market works and all the rest of it. So I have spent really all of my working life opposing this. I've opposed it as a theatre critic because theatre is a fundamentally collective form of experience where people come together to be human together. And that's why I was drawn to theatre at the very beginning of this period. Although I'd had no prior interest in it, it wasn't really my bag at all when I was in my 20s. But towards the end of my 20s, I found I was irresistibly drawn to it. And looking back, I think it's because I knew that we were going into an age of individualism that was not just spontaneous, but was also being manipulated in that direction by the powers that be. And I thought, if we're going to resist this, then we have to keep going to the places where people come together to experience things. Theatre's not the only one, of course. People do it through music. People do it through political activities like this. But that was why I became a theatre critic, I think, at the deepest level at that time, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And of course, later on, I became a political commentator and a civic activist, working for a Scottish Parliament, which I thought would provide us with a bulwark against some of the worst excesses of neoliberalism at Westminster, which never, by the way, commanded majority support among the UK electorate, never mind the Scottish electorate. It was just that at the time it was the largest minority, and as ever, the centre-left response to it was feeble. So what's happened this year is that the nature of the right-wing project that I've been confronting all my life, I think, has fundamentally changed. In this year, it has turned on a sixpence. In a sense, you could have seen it coming. From the time of the crash in 2008, it was fairly obvious that the neoliberal project was beginning to have run its course. That the idea that the market would solve everything, and that kind of, sort of morality-free, intervention-free, regulation-free way of running free markets had actually hit the buffers, although the immediate consequences of it were very much muffled by the fact that governments bailed them out to such a massive extent. But nonetheless, the sort of shock waves from that rolling on have, I think, produced a complete change in the political landscape, which has suddenly broken through to the surface this year. And what has happened is that the right, with many of the same players still in place, I mean, people like the main media owners, notably Rupert Murdoch, but a lot of the other people who are involved in the kind of right-wing project across the West and across other parts of the planet, arguably as well, have shifted their ground from a neoliberal position to a position which is more like a sort of neoconservative, neo-nationalist, mildly in some cases and actually in other cases proto-fascist position, which is quite familiar. It's quite a familiar switch from the 1930s, actually. People moved from a neoliberal free market position to a sort of nationalist, protectionist, right-wing, authoritarian position very rapidly. And I've been actually finding it quite stressful and extremely hard work this year as a columnist to keep up with the speed of the shift. Sadly, not in the centre-left and left-wing politics that I would like to see, but the speed of the shift in the nature of the right-wing politics we're confronting. But that is what has happened with Trump and Brexit. And if you note the speed with which the great survivors of British politics, the Conservative Party, have moved to a much more strongly nationalist and anti, sort of protectionist almost position, certainly vis-a-vis our European neighbours, then that is interesting too. And of course, it's horrifying. We only have to look at our history to see where a great big powerful right-wing bloc taking up that kind of politics tends to lead. And it's really not a pretty picture. So that's what we're confronting.
Thanks very much.
Right, yes, okay, excellent. I agree with most of what Joyce has said. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to describe all of the things that happened in 2016, because obviously we'd be here all night if we went through everything. And I'm instead going to think about the different ways in which we can collectively and individually cope with 2016. I had written a big long list, which is kind of the curse of the BuzzFeed generation that I'm a member of. It means that you tend to end up writing lists of individual points. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to share two quotes with you. from two different Scottish writers, because I think that what we are, in trying to understand what's happening in 2016 and trying to digest it all, it has been so overwhelming that what we have instinctively done is looked back for historic precedents. Joyce mentioned the 1930s. I think there's also a case for looking at parallels with the 1960s as well, actually, and you can almost sort of chart it in terms of saying it's as though we are either living through the 1930s but with somewhat better economic circumstances, or we are living through the 1960s but with far more grim and bleak economic circumstances, certainly when it comes to the crucial issue of equality, really. So with that in mind, and there is also another point as well, which I think you do see in a lot of the electoral events that have served to shake things up over the past year. And actually, you've been able to see this for some time, in terms of, it's almost as if we're in a strange kind of postmodern feedback loop, whereby a generation of people who, for some strange reason, desperately want to live in the 1950s, are intent on stopping the dreams of younger generations who desperately want to live in the 1960s. So I think that there is a strange kind of element of repetition there in terms of what's happening. But fundamentally, I think in Scotland, and this is a crucial thing, Scotland doesn't matter. I think what this year's events have demonstrated, that Scotland does not matter in the grand scheme of things. With Donald Trump in the White House, who knows what Scotland's position will be? Who knows what his position will be in Scotland, and therefore what Scotland's global position is going to be? He may take advantage of it and try to finally do something about that wind farm off the northeast coast. Hopefully he won't, but who can say? Again, we're in an entirely unknown, unprecedented situation. So, two quotes that sum up the different ways in which you can cope with these kind of moments of monumental change. The first is from Eric Linklater, writing in the 1930s, and he says, "Have I said we are an independent people? It is one of the blessings of a small land. For freedom of opinion, even of action, is still permissible in small places. And when I see the decency of the world progressively menaced by such things as the corporate state and other such heresies of the anthill, I think of the littleness of Orkney and remember with comfort that the Icelandic proverb that says, 'Little things are the last to be found.'" This is feeding back quite a lot, is it? Okay, no bother. So that's one approach that you can take to, seismic events in the world if you're a Scot. But here's another one, which is from Edwin Morgan and his poem "The Flowers of Scotland" from 1969. And this is where Morgan is really reflecting on the fact that ultimately the 60s didn't really happen in Scotland. You could argue that it was very much something that happened in London, that happened elsewhere. I'm sure there are people in the room with memories longer than mine who might be able to reflect on that in a bit more detail. But basically what Morgan was saying here in this poem is, how as a Scot do you deal with this fact that global events are running away with themselves? And he says, "Yes, it is too cold in Scotland for flower people, and in any case, who would be handed a thistle? What are our flowers? Locked swings and private rivers, and the island of Staffa on sale on the open market, which no one questions or thinks strange." And then he goes on a bit, and then intriguingly he says, "And a Scottish National Party that refuses to discuss Vietnam and is even applauded for doing so. Do they really think there is no lesson to be learned from what is going on there?" Now, I think to sum up what I'm trying to say here is that as people who live in Scotland, who have ideas about what Scotland can be, in these very, very troubled times that we're now living in, there are two approaches. Now, you have to remember for Morgan as well, the fact that the 60s weren't happening in Scotland and the cultural revolution of the 60s wasn't happening in Scotland was actually, of course, as a gay man, would have had very direct impacts on his own life. let's not forget, homosexuality legalised in England and Wales in 1967, not legalised in Scotland until 1980. So I think we really have to understand this crucial point that what is happening in 2016 is a restarting, a re-intensifying of these culture wars, which everybody assumed were already decided in cultural terms in the 1960s and in economic and class terms in the 1980s. I think what is terrifying and absolutely fascinating at the same time about 2016 is that in actual fact, those culture wars and those class wars, it's in reality, we're only just getting started, I think, and I will end there.
Right. I'll ask you to keep me to time. I'm a new face here, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Heather Burns, and I'm a digital law specialist. I work with tech businesses and the digital industry to help them understand the impact of laws and policies on their work and how these sort of pieces of legislation translate into geek. And Chris spoke about historical precedent. And I can certainly say from the perspective of my industry that there is no precedent for 2016. This is completely new territory. Digital is a young industry. It's literally young in technology and it's literally young in people. This is a bit of an ageist statement, but as you can see, most people in tech are under the age of 40, certainly under the age of 50. We have only ever known the European Union. We have only ever known freedom of movement. We have only ever known hopping on a plane as if it was absolutely nothing. The digital and tech industries, be it the amazing little tech cluster over at the Quarter Mile, or a digital agency based in the East Midlands but distributed around the world, or a tech giant based in London, all of these companies have been based and have been built on two things. One is the free flow of data, and two is the free flow of people. Tech needs data to flow seamlessly across borders based on a legal basis. And tech needs talent. Tech needs those people who can hop on a plane and start working in another country without a visa, without a lengthy process. Both of these things are now under threat for our industry this year. Digital is starting off on the back foot in any case because one of the biggest problems in our industry it is woefully miscounted and undercounted. Economic activity is still counted on taxonomies, which by and large were drawn up after World War II to measure economic reconstruction. These taxonomies are very heavy on, literally heavy, industry. They are only updated once a generation or so, and they are also grounded in international taxonomies. That's so we can measure economic activity across countries. So it's not just a Scottish problem, it's not just a UK problem, it's a global problem. The tech industry, by some estimates, within the UK is undercounted by at least 400,000 businesses, and by extension, millions of employees. If you work in digital in the UK, your work literally does not count. According to economic taxonomies, your work is other economic activity not elsewhere classified. And that goes for Scottish economic taxonomies, that goes for UK, that goes for European. We also tend to be a very tribal industry. We don't play well together. We're working on it. But we lack any sort of professional organization. And this has become a bit of a toxic soup, which has caught us on the back foot this year. Because the legal basis for the free flow of data across borders is now under threat in the form of Brexit. The legal basis for the free flow of people across borders is now under threat. And the Department for Exiting the EU is taking representations from industries, but we can't organize ourselves enough to show up. I'm used to going to conferences and taking questions from people about, how do I get my e-commerce business compliant with such and such law? Or how do I make sure that people with disabilities can access our app based on this current legal framework? I'm now getting people coming up to me with tears in their eyes saying, can I still live here? Am I going to have to leave my family? So this is a really unprecedented time for digital, in that a young, growing industry, which has always been borderless, is now losing the very legal foundation which we have built on. And yesterday, in the Scottish Government's report on what they would like to see from the Brexit negotiations, the Scottish Government said, we would like Scotland to remain part of the digital single market strategy after Brexit. This is the European strategy. It's not the single market, it's the digital single market. It's a strategy that basically sees all of Europe as one unified digital marketplace that you can order something from Greece or Spain as if it was coming from Edinburgh. So this is a really tough time for us, in that we are seeing borders and battle lines drawn when we really just want to get on with our work.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Heather. And we're going to hear from Andy, and then we're going to have one more round and then open up for discussion. Andy.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks for the invitation to be along here tonight. I've got a special relationship with Bella. I published a piece in the first edition, which was not digital. I think you run out of copies now, Mike. Did you sell them off for 100 quid or something? Yeah. I've also got another admission to make, and that's at the Solas Festival this year. I was asked to make a prediction for the next time a particular show was on, and I predicted that the next time this show was on, we would have voted to leave the EU, which we did. And then we had a sweepstake in the Green Group in Parliament as to who was going to win the US presidential election, and I thought Trump did. So I don't know if this is good or not, but certainly it may just be a product of me getting my first proper job in 25 years, but I certainly feel a little bit confused and tired and uncertain all across. And I think uncertainty and isolationism are going to be two kind of key words to keep in mind over the next few years. I have some history with Trump in relation to his Scottish dealings, and never actually took his presidential bid seriously. Although when I was asked to predict, I think at that stage I realised he was got a good chance of it. He is an egoist. A very big egotist. I think nothing is going to go well. I fear for the fragility of US democracy. I was speaking to a Tory MSP the other day who's reading the works of the anti-federalists. That was Madison and people who were against the US Constitution because they didn't believe, they believed that the US Constitution was going to lead to a monarchical power, just what they were trying to get away from. And of course it was the anti-federalists who then campaigned for the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And I think, and the Electoral College, of course, was constructed partly to give whites in the South, who didn't have much population but lots of slaves, so they sought an equal voice, but also as a bulwark against tyranny that some people feared the US Constitution would lead to. Anyway, I think the predominant fears I have are around the ugly nature of US politics and the racism and intolerance, and I think they will grow. On the upside, of course, across the water, Bernie Sanders made socialism a polite word once more in the US, and I would not underestimate the significant achievement in doing that. It was actually quite a remarkable campaign, and it reminds us that although we've heard reference to the 30s and all the rest of it, populism can easily feed on isolationism and fear and all the rest of it. Fundamentally, other campaigns that are more full of hope can also succeed. Obviously, the EU referendum was a very big event. I don't use the word Brexit. I think it's a horrible word for a start, and it excludes Northern Ireland, in my view. But it's going to utterly change our relationship as individuals, as communities, as regions, countries, across the UK with the rest of Europe. I thought yesterday's paper by the Scottish Government, Scotland's Place in Europe, is a very serious and thoughtful piece of work. I'd just rather it had been announced to Parliament before the press, but there'll be issues around that in the new year. And the implications for Scotland, I think, are very, very profound, and no doubt we will discuss some of them this evening. And finally, on the international stage, of course, to the left of us, to the east of us, we have a resurgent Russia with very little, one fears, in the way of instincts to join a broad, liberal, democratic world. I was just downloaded and briefly scanned Amnesty International's report they published just 2 days this week, I think, on human rights in Crimea. And it makes very, very grim reading indeed. On the upside again, in Europe, of course, we had the election of Alexander Van der Bellen as the president of Austria, which was a small mercy, I think, at the time. Of course, the highlight for me in 2016 was getting elected to Holyrood and joining a group of 6 Greens, which is very encouraging, and joining a parliament as well with the largest number of new members since the very first one, and that in itself is, most of them are Tory, but they are new, and any individual new person brings new perspective and new challenges to the old order, the old way of doing things, with new powers, of course, with many mandates, no majority and multiple mandates, and I think that's very good, and also a 5-year term, which should be enough time to get some serious reform done, some transformational change. I reflected in a lecture I gave the Stephen Maxwell Memorial Lecture the other week about what I believe is an important job to do here in Scotland, and also a very important one in response to global trends, which is to deepen and strengthen our democratic institutions and the extent to which people feel engaged and have a meaningful role and place and voice in the issues that affect their everyday lives. And that is actually a very, very big project. It was a big project in the late 19th century. It was a proud project in the late 19th century. 100 years ago, MPs would get elected here and we'd see them off at Waverley Station. There'd be a pipe band playing, the provost would give a speech, and you wouldn't see them again. They'd be off to sue for peace in the Sudan or repeal the Corn Laws or extend the franchise or, whatever they did. Because 99% of what affected the citizens of this city was undertaken by the corporation. The corporation, did housing, did lighting, did energy, and all the rest of it. And it's that steady erosion and uncertainty about where state power lies, and I think the need to rebuild the local state that's vitally important. And finally, just one other thing. This has been, I think, will be the warmest year on record. We've got massive, massive challenges in terms of climate change. Some of them we'll be facing in the Parliament with the new climate change plan, which we're going to have to deal with things like heat, agriculture and transport, which are pretty tricky issues. And we're also going to have to confront some serious challenges about, for example, leaving oil in the ground. We need to leave about 2/3 of it in the ground to avoid the 2 degrees, never mind the 1.5 degrees that we aspire to. And yet the First Minister this week was talking about not leaving it in the ground, but who's going to benefit from the 20 billion barrels of oil that still lie in the North Sea. And the Environment Secretary today was in the chamber addressing criticism of the SNP's policies on air passenger duty, saying we can manage this increase in emissions because it will deliver economic growth. And finally, just one little thing was nice today to uplift us. I think, as I understand, the First Minister has a fear of dogs. We had some puppies in Parliament today. Because there was a debate on the puppy trade. And the SSPCA, Nicola Sturgeon, visited this morning and they worked her through her fear of dogs. So I think that's quite nice.
Thanks very much, Andy. So we want to move quite quickly to discussion and question. So I'm going to ask Joyce to all of our panel to go again, but to be as succinct as possible. And your 5 minutes have become 3.
And this is about what happens next, what we should do now. Well, I'm going to make it's on. Good. I'm going to make it about what we should do now. I think, first of all, we just have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that there's no quick fix for the scale of problems that we're facing. I mean, the things Andy has just talked about, the things that all the panellists have talked about are not going to be resolved, by a quick vote for Scotland to leave the UK or another vote to remain in the UK, in what I would see as a kind of worst case scenario, I have to say. And certainly the emergence of some kind of inspired leader of the centre left. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is about as good as it's going to get. And frankly, much though I admire Nicola, I think there's a limit to the kind of, to what one individual like that can do. So I don't think, despite Bernie Sanders, despite the best Hillary Clinton could do, despite Nicola, despite other leaders on the centre left, despite Andy, and other terrific spokespeople like Caroline Lucas for the Green cause, I don't think there's going to be a quick fix of some kind of left-wing alternative or centre-left alternative pulling itself together quickly. So where does that leave us? I think the only models we can use, and we have to bear in mind all the time the truth that we're living in a digital age now and not just one of the traditional methods of political organisation. But nonetheless, I think we're still looking at a situation, and this very much goes to what Andy was just saying about rebuilding our own democracy, that if we're going to have centre-left progressive parties or political groupings which work in the future, it's because they've got a renewed grassroots strength to them. We've seen enough of the sort of Blairite phase of centre-left, so-called centre-left politics, which was all about selling centre-left politics as if it was just another brand of soap, ignoring the grassroots of your own party, ignoring the links with the trade union movement in the case of the Labour Party. That has not worked. In fact, it's been a disaster. It's led to the extreme vulnerability of the centre-left mainstream political parties that we've seen over this past couple of years with the rise of the centre-right, and their main answer being, oh dear, everybody's looking a bit right-wing, we better be a bit more right-wing as well. With some notable exceptions, that has basically been the position of mainstream so-called centre-left parties in Europe and even in America. And I think, it's just not good enough. And the only way they're going to develop the strength for that kind of resistance is if they have real grassroots support behind them. Now, what is that grassroots support going to look like in the 21st century? That's a different question. Obviously, the old model of the workplace organised trade union movement as the basis for your most effective political party is not there anymore. It's going to be different kinds of community groups. I think it will have to be strengthened forms of local government. And my hunch, and this is going back to Andy's agenda again, is that it will have something to do with empowering local communities through new forms of energy, which are generated in local communities and over which local communities have some control. If you look at the history of kind of modern civilization, particularly in the UK, it's so much to do with where the energy was. First it was coal, the coal owners, then the workers, the mine workers as the sort of union of unions organising themselves against those owners. For Scotland, it's very much been the coal, the heavy industries that came with coal, then the oil, which gave us another vision of ourselves for the late 20th century. But now, as Andy says, we really have to think responsibly about leaving the oil in the ground. So where are we going next? I think to a redistribution of power through a redistribution of the way we get our energy. That's my hunch. I mean, I may be completely wrong, but I think there's something there. And finally, if I could just say one last sentence, as a person who has spent all these years reporting on the cultural scene in Scotland, I think, the need for creativity and for that kind of free thinking and open thinking, for the arts, for poetry, for music, for all the things that raise our spirits in what are undoubtedly going to be tough times and give us new visions to get us through, has never been greater. And I hope everyone who's involved in politics will take time out to think in terms of their cultural experience and the sort of joy that can bring, as well as of the nuts and bolts of politics. Thanks.
Thank you much.
Right, okay. So the most some very quick important things to say. I think what is positive is that we do now have the mother of all deadlines, if you like, which is really 2020, which is the point at which there will be an opportunity to get rid of Trump and to work towards that on the basis of actually just quite literally saving the planet, really. And I think that we can. I think hopefully people will kind of be marshaled behind that. To me, the crucial thing isn't so much about ideology or left or right, and I say that as somebody who is very much of the left. But I think the really crucial question is all about the public sphere, and by the public sphere, I don't just mean the media. That's an absolutely crucial part of it. I mean public institutions. I mean universities. I mean the theatres, and as Joyce has mentioned, these people, these institutions, need to come off the fence now, or they will be swept up by the tide of authoritarian nationalism as well. If you look at what's happened in Russia, that's been a big part of the experience. In Scotland, that's particularly relevant. It is a particularly relevant point in Scotland because, of course, historically, the civic society has played a really significant role. As a stateless nation, we have tended to rely very heavily on civic institutions like universities to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So what we need is these kind of organisations to actually become participants and to take sides, because a big part, an enormous part of the neoliberal project was about getting those institutions to become notionally neutral, but actually to be colonised by the ideologies of neoliberalism, the practices, the entire way of thinking about it. We are in the city of enlightenment, obviously, and these values really are under threat, and I just hope that we are able to persuade these people with their very, very handsome salaries and pensions and houses that actually they are not safe either, and I think that's a really crucial point. I would just end by saying that essentially authoritarian nationalism isn't going to work, and the reason it's not going to work it's not going to work in terms of mass deportations of people, and I think the points that we heard there about digital are a really good example of that. What I think you would end up with, the logic of where authoritarian nationalism is going, is some kind of global apartheid system where there is a very, very hierarchical way of organising things. And of course, if you think about the apartheid system, it was actually all about the need for cheap labour, particularly with regard to extractive industries. So that's actually the nature of the threat. You can call that fascism, you can call it whatever you like, but I think it's very important to understand what's going to happen. And I think that the really important point, I think, is that in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, Martin Luther King said, he said, the question is not whether we will be extremists, the question is what kind of extremists will we be? And he then went on to say, the nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. So creative extremism is my answer to what we can do next. Hopefully we'll see some of it in 2017.
Wow, how do I follow on from that? I've often said that I felt like I've been pushing a rock up a hill for many years, trying to get my industry to think of issues in terms of people's own responsibility as designers, as developers, as the creators of software applications, to things like privacy, to data protection. And along comes Donald Trump and does more for me than I could have done in years. But in all seriousness, what I am finding with my own industry is that people are not willing or able to wait for governments or politics or the law to do the job for them. And we are seeing some rather wonderful creative extremism. People are talking about encrypt your websites and all your communications. People are talking about clear out your unnecessary data and delete it all after a certain amount of time. These are things which have always been codified in law. But now, certainly for us in the UK, that legal basis, which is the EU data protection regime, is under threat. Many of my friends and colleagues in the United States have signed an absolutely harrowing petition this week, which you can see at neveragain.tech. And this is a petition where American tech professionals have vowed not to participate, if ordered, in the creation of any sort of database to categorize American citizens by nationality, religion, or race. And it made my stomach churn to think that this even needs to exist. But it does. The problem is government doesn't need to order any tech company to build a database. It already has that data. So people are starting to think creatively about how to minimize the data that's out there, how to protect each other. This morning we had the verdict concerning DRIPA, which has a knock-on effect for the Investigatory Powers Act, where the European Court of Justice, which has nothing to do with the European Union, ruled that mass data retention and of all communications data here in the UK is not compliant with European data protection law. I think David Davis wants to head out for his Christmas break a bit early now. So it remains to be seen whether Theresa May uses that as leverage to say, this is the EU interfering, we need to get on with Brexit, or if they go back and do the right thing. So my industry has had so many reasons to be fearful and to be uncertain and to feel unstable. But as Chris said, when I look at what people are developing and thinking about and the processes they're working through and the answers they're coming up with on their own to deal with these problems without waiting for a government or a legal solution or a negotiation, I find hope. And I'm going to keep my hope in my industry, and I know they're going to come through in 2017.